main man, Kash Patel, is in the house. He was just exonerated. The information came out today about Liz Cheney, suppressed information that the former president did ask troops to be present. I'm happy to have Kash here today, but I want to talk about the bloodshed should bother us. Just using the word bloodshed.
Well, using the word singularly alone, sure, but when you look at it in the arc of this modern day politics, every media outlet that criticized President Trump has used the word bloodshed against President Trump before he made this statement. And when you take it in the context of literally what he's talking about, the United Auto Workers and the auto worker industry, you know, I think the comments were taken out of context by many in the mainstream media to have that campaign out there that's saying Donald Trump wants bloodshed. But when you look at his actions, Donald Trump's the one that ended forever wars. Joe Biden started two forever wars in the Ukraine and Israel. Joe Biden murdered 13 American soldiers in Afghanistan with his disastrous withdrawal. Joe Biden is the reason we have dozens of American hostages in captivity in Israel.
I love the way you pivot. Okay, let me give you that. But we're talking about the insinuation of bloodshed among Americans.
Yeah, we can't have that. And look, as a guy who worked for President Trump, I don't think he would ever do that. I don't think he means that in any sort of overt physical way. I think he means it in the sense that you saw him.
But shouldn't, in his own words, he clarify it?
Listen, what I've learned about President Trump is he's going to be able to dictate the narrative to the media in terms of what's important for the political race, and I think he's done that. Will he clarify it going forward? He might, but I've learned that he's the best messenger for himself.
Talk to us about the news that broke today about Liz Cheney suppressing the information, particularly the corroboration of your testimony.
Yeah, look, the truth's the truth. You know that, Armstrong. You know, I've been here with you for years talking about what happened days before January 6th in the Oval Office with the president and his National Command Authority and the authorized 10,000+ National Guard. Look, I was subpoenaed by Jan 6, special counsel, everyone in between, and I said the truth for the last 3 years. And I was knocked by saying there's no way Donald Trump didn't do more. And I said legally he couldn't do more. And what do we have today, right? Just like the Russiagate narrative where you had the FBI withhold evidence of innocence from a federal court to unlawfully surveil a political target, now we shift to the legislative branch, and Liz Cheney and the January 6th committee buried the one transcript of a career Secret Service officer who literally testified before that committee 2 years ago and said everything about Donald Trump's authorization of the National Guard days before January 6th was true, and he acted on it. And we are only just getting that transcript now?
Let me tell you what's even sadder. The mainstream media and many in Congress were also aware of Donald Trump's position as it relates to the National Guard. Why don't we ever see this integrity, this honesty, this fact about what actually happened in regards to his wanting the National Guard present?
To me, it's disinformation and politics at play. To me, it's a cadre of people in the mainstream media that don't want Donald Trump to be the president again, and so they have ignited the insurrection narrative for the last 3 years. This DOJ didn't charge Donald Trump with insurrection lawfully because he didn't commit it, so they've carried the political narrative in the courts of public opinion to say Donald Trump did commit insurrection. Now we find out that we've been saying the truth the whole time, but it's 3 years hence. Just like Russiagate, Donald Trump's a Russian asset. For 3 years, the country was lied to. Now, Donald Trump committed insurrection. For 3 years, the country was lied to. And the singular piece of evidence was withheld by Liz Cheney. I think there needs to be a congressional investigation on what else was withheld from the American people and what might have been destroyed and what other lies were told. We're owed that.
Of all the 90 counts that this president faces, a man of the law as yourself, a man of honor as yourself, which do you feel have legitimacy?
I don't think any of them do.
None of them.
I mean, look what...
None of them.
We could talk about Georgia.
No,
I think.
I don't want to talk. I want to ask you.
Yeah.
You're a person that has integrity. You're saying to us that none of the 90 plus?
Zero.
Zero.
Zero. We could talk about each count.
So this is a witch hunt.
This is a two-tier system of justice politicizing itself to achieve a political...
Not even the classified documents.
That's the worst one of all, in my opinion. He has presidential privilege and Presidential Records Act authority based on Bill Clinton's actions. Whether you agree with that is not the point. If a federal court already adjudicated it and you're not going to apply it as your DOJ's uniform system of law, then we've bifurcated the system. And when you have Joe Biden, when you juxtapose his case next to Donald Trump's and you say, we're not going to prosecute him because he's feeble and old, that's not even an excuse.
What about the Georgia interference case, where you have the workers on the record, Rudy Giuliani, and a lot of his legal term admitting to guilt? I mean, they are the witnesses against the former president, the people that work for him and know him best. This is not as if Democrats are making allegations, Kash.
No, they're not. But when you have the prosecutor in the case commit multiple felonies during a prosecution, to me, you have destroyed due process.
We agree on that, but
Yes.
What about his actions? Is there any legitimacy to election interference, Kash?
No, because if you look at the transcript, just like the Ukraine transcript, when they cut it up and put it out and said there was a quid pro quo, then we released the whole thing and everybody read it and said, okay, there's not. Just like here, Raffensperger and company had the full transcript, had the full narrative, and President Trump didn't demand anything. Don't listen to me. Read that transcript where he says, put it all out there. And that's not election interference. That's a guy saying, I'm battling for my political life, put out the votes. I don't see that as election interference, and he didn't make a threat to anyone physically or financially or it crippled their careers.
The man that was closest to him and loyal to him for all 4 years of his presidency, Michael Pence, refuses to endorse him, to support him again. And you respect Mike Pence.
Sure, as a man, of course I respect him for serving this country.
What is he telling us by not endorsing him?
I think Mike Pence is being politically small.
Small?
I think he's,
Really?
Yeah, I think he could have stood up and said, we still agree, he and Donald Trump, on 90+% of the conservative values they share, and that would be a direction which a Republican would want the country to go. But instead he comes out and says, I'm not going to endorse Donald Trump. Now, it's not going to change any votes.
Asked him to choose between him and the Constitution. And you are a man about the rule of law.
Yeah, I don't believe that President Trump asked him to choose between the two. President Trump asked him, you have to go certify the vote. I, as the candidate for the president of the United States, believe, and whether you agree with him or not is not the point. He's allowed to challenge the election results lawfully, just like the Democrats called it out in 2016 when Hillary Clinton and company said, we're going to challenge the results, along with Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries.
So you don't feel Pence should have certified the elections? I'm shocked to hear this, by the way.
No, I feel Pence should have, as vice president, should have had more engagements with his boss about the certification of the elections.
But he did.
Well, not that I'm tracking.
He did. And then when the violence, and it was violence because I was inside the Capitol, took place on January 6th, Trump did not even ask about the welfare. Pence felt betrayed by him.
Well, that's a question you're going to have to ask him, because I spoke to Mike Pence on the day of January 6th as the chief of staff at DOD, and we ensured his security along with senior congressional leadership, many of which were already flown out of the United States
We
Capitol.
have no doubt about that. But did he hear from his commander-in-chief?
That I don't know. I don't have.
But you do know.
No.
Oh.
How would I know if
because
the
it's all everybody. It's all he said it. Pence himself said he never heard from him.
Well, why would Pence need to hear from Donald Trump on that day?
You know, I'm going to take a break. That's what I'm going to do, because you are a lawyer. And now I feel like I'm in a courtroom. Okay? And we'll be back, okay? Yes. I want to leave that alone. We'll be back. It was shocking when a reporter asked President Biden on Air Force One today what are his plans for the borders and the overwhelming influx of migrants coming in, and about his executive order. And he, without hesitating, said, I will issue no executive orders. Stunning.
It's tragic. This 24 hours after an individual who is a member of a foreign terrorist organization was stopped on the southern border and reported to DHS that his purpose for coming into America was to explode a bomb in a major American city. I mean, that's the type of violence that's coming in through the southern border. So the border issue has been completely politicized. This is, if you're a national security guy like me, securing the border is not a political thing. We've been doing, I did it for 16 years, for Obama, for Bush, for Trump, and everybody in between. And it became a political issue now all of a sudden that President Trump came in and put his wall up and tried to secure the border, and I think he succeeded. And now we've seen the reverse of that. I mean, between narco trafficking, the fentanyl trade, human smuggling, and the fact that Chris Wray and Alexander Mayorkas testified to Congress 90 days ago that they have lost 24 known foreign terrorist affiliates inside of the United States of America. That is a scary statistic. That is how 9/11 happened.
Since we're talking about the interior of our security, should the Senate ban TikTok?
So I think TikTok, from an intelligence perspective, tunnels information through the United States and sends it back to mainland China. And my ultimate goal is to divest the CCP's ties to TikTok. If we can successfully do that, then we can turn off the spigot of information that goes back to mainland China.
They're not going to separate themselves from ByteDance.
Well, that's what the legislation is talking about doing. So if the legislation passes, it's not a TikTok ban, it's divesting ByteDance ownership. I think, and I'm all for that style of victory, because when I was Deputy Director of National Intelligence, we were the ones that called out TikTok because they were caught sending information to mainland China. And when we publicized it, we got excoriated for it in the Trump administration just because the president had the gall to put that out there. It's not an easy thing to do, to attack a company of that nature. But now we know 4 years later, half of Congress agrees with that position.
You know, I listened to the Supreme Court today, and their skepticism in allowing the Republicans in the states of Missouri and other places to limit the Biden administration's influence with social media and saying that there's disinformation, misinformation. They seem to be more in favor, the majority of them, continuing the Biden administration to use these technology giants to limit or even censor posts on social media.
It's a huge problem, and it started before the Biden administration. Chris Wray created an election integrity task force at the FBI prior to the last presidential election. 85 agents and lawyers would meet every week with Facebook, Google, Twitter, and whatever other big company there was, and they would suggest to them what content should be on there and what shouldn't. They would suggest to them who should be on and who shouldn't. And the crux of this U.S. Supreme Court case that you're talking about is, was that coercive? Was that forceful? And I think when the number one law enforcement in the world comes to your doorstep and says, we don't really like these guys, you might not want to consider this, that's a little more than a suggestion. And I think that's the question the court's going to have to answer. Is that style of behavior overreach from the Bureau? I think it is.
You know, given your role, I want to come back to Liz Cheney and what we discussed earlier. Given your role during the time of the events, how do you respond to the allegations of suppressed evidence in the Cheney scandal? And what impact, the most important question is, what impact do you believe this has on the credibility of the insurrection narrative?
I think it's the insurrection exoneration. Mm-hmm. It's the quintessential piece of evidence. If Donald Trump did not authorize the troops, then that insurrection narrative would have evidence to stand on. But since we now know what I've been saying for 3 years is the truth, because look at it this way. How is it legally and factually possible for Mayor Bowser and the Capitol Police and Nancy Pelosi to reject in writing the National Guard if President Trump never authorized them? Putting that aside, we find out today, or this week, that this transcript comes out that this career apolitical Secret Service officer confirms all of it, not some of it, all of it, because he was in charge of presidential protection for the White House and the president writ large, so he was acting on a lot of different orders. It's all in his transcript. And so for Liz Cheney to go out there and say, and this is what you said, we summarized it in our findings. Well, why is that the one transcript you didn't release to the American public? How do you answer that question with a straight face? And what you asked, what gets hurt? It's the thing you and I care about the most, the truth. The truth gets hurt for 3 years. The insurrection narrative lives on for 3 years as a disinformation campaign. And now the mainstream media will move on to their next one.
From your perspective as a former chief of staff to the acting secretary of defense, how significant is the role of internal government communications and documentation in shaping public narratives around national security incidents?
It's critical. And I think a large portion of that should be made public at some point, depending on the national security situation. But this is a national security situation that we're talking about, January 6th. And I think Congress owes the American people every document the committee found, not the cherry-picked ones, every email, every phone call, every text message. And I think they should be sending out subpoenas and asking these people to testify, like Cassidy Hutchinson, in public again, and ask her, why did you lie about what Donald Trump did?
But he tried to commandeer the presidential limousine, which is not even true.
That's what I'm saying, right? Another Secret Service officer came out and said, the driver said,
but it was never believable, actually. Because he'd have to come from the back of the vehicle.
No, you and I know.
And they have a wall there to protect him.
You and I know that.
It never made any sense.
But the rest of America doesn't know how the beast operates, and what they do is they listen to the mainstream media. The narrative that somehow Donald Trump wanted to commandeer a vehicle was already out there. And I think we've done maybe irreparable damage to a lot of oversight measures in Congress. Because people are now like, well, I'm not going to believe anything these people do.
You know, reflecting on the situation, what steps do you believe the Department of Defense and other governmental agencies can take to ensure transparency and accountability in situations that are of immense public interest?
This is one of the leading efforts I try to explain in my book. So what they can do is really simple. One, communicate to your oversight committees in Congress immediately of any significant national security issue. It's the law. You report to them. Too many of these secretaries and directors have forgotten that or have jettisoned that responsibility. Two, at the appropriate time, immediately declassify as much information underlying that decision-making process as you can to the American public, whether it's a drone strike, a hostage rescue operation, a military op, intelligence matter. America has lost the belief in our government's credibility to tell them why they did something or didn't do something. And in order to restore that, we can do those two simple things on a routine basis.
Why would the Senate Majority Leader, who just happens to be Jewish, one of the most powerful people in Congress, Chuck Schumer, why would he, in a critical stage with Netanyahu and their friends, say that they need to have immediate elections and that Netanyahu needs to be removed? Is he doing Biden's bidding to provide cover?
Yes. Don't take my word for it. President Biden admitted that the day before Chuck Schumer made that statement, Schumer's office and President Biden's office had a conversation on that exact topic. And President Biden didn't say, don't do that. I'm the commander-in-chief. The legislative branch has no ability to speak to a foreign leader and tell them and their nation that he shouldn't be its leader. I mean, it is literally impermissible for Congress to do that. And it all, in my opinion, directs towards the two-state solution that this ethos has been issuing and authoring for the last decade, from the Iran deal, JCPOA, to its renewal request, and now here, the desire to put Hamas and terrorists on equal footing as innocent Americans and Israelis. I disagree with that, but that's the position they have taken, and their target is Benjamin Netanyahu for whatever reason, and they want him out so they can put in their solution. And I think, I'm not Jewish, but I think they ticked off a lot of Israelis and Jewish folks around the world with that kind of statement.
The biggest news of today, which is getting a little play, is what Putin said, that this Ukraine conflict has brought the United States and the world closer to a nuclear war than ever in our historical relationship, is what he said.
I hope that's not true.
But it's what he said.
I know it's what he said. And I don't have a insight into what Biden's doing and this administration's doing to deter the actual nuclear threat that he's talking about. That's very scary. That is the ultimate. That's the thing we guarded against the most when it came to Iran, right? We do not want them to have a nuclear weapon for this specific reason. Now, look, Vladimir Putin is probably the world's best propagandist and knows how to take the world stage, especially after he just got elected again for the 5th consecutive time, I think, and scare the world. And he's been doing that because we have had an ineffective commander-in-chief in America that doesn't know how to respond to that. And his only response to it, Joe Biden's, is we're going to cut you a bigger check. We're going to send Ukraine more money. And that's what's singularly, I don't ever agree with Putin on this. But when another nation like Sweden just joins NATO, in Putin's mind and in many Russians' mind, they have violated the agreement when the wall came down that they would not expand that front of countries on their western border. And it's been continuously expanded. So from his perspective, he thinks he's justified.
How do you respond to that?
Well, if we had a commander-in-chief that was respected, you would pick up the phone and call him immediately and say, we got to tone that down. We can't have that kind of rhetoric. And also, how do we figure out a way to end this war in the Ukraine? What is it that we need? One of those, remember in the old days when the military leaders and the presidents would go meet at a certain location, whether it was World War II or what have you, and have a summit or whatever you want to call it? We need one of those. Somebody needs to broker one of these because too many innocent people are getting murdered in this world war that is turning into another Afghanistan. $125 billion already spent in the Ukraine. Thousands of people murdered on all sides of the equation. And we're no closer to peace.
What do you predict the outcome will be now that Israel is going into Rafah?
From their perspective, they have the right to do it, to clear out the terrorists that are causing this war.
But are they going to build Gaza back? Are they going to build an infrastructure?
You're talking about a thing that will take decades.
The Saudis have offered to pay for it.
Then maybe that's a realistic option. I just don't know how you appease the terrorists that are still there. To me, that's the question that has to be answered. They're the enemy in terms of Israel versus anything in the Gaza Strip is Hamas, a foreign terrorist organization, which we have now finally recognized, again, under the Biden administration.
You know, it's always a pleasure talking to you. We're bringing on the old guard, Jim Pinkerton and David Keene. You know those guys. Yeah. They're giants in the industry. They will join us to talk about more issues facing our country and the world. Man, Kash, brother.
Pleasure.
It's always a pleasure.
Good.
I don't agree with you about Trump is innocent on all the charges, but I respect you.
Hey.
And you're a lawyer. Remember, you're a lawyer. And your lawyer is always to defend. Your client is always right. But anyhow, always appreciate having you on.
Thanks,
we'll be right back after this short commercial break.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. and welcome back to the broadcast. David Keene, former presidential advisor and newspaper editor, and formerly the opinion editor of the Washington Times, joins us, and he's former president of the National... Listen, David Keene. So Jim Pinkerton, this is David Keene, I'm introducing you. Jim Pinkerton...
He's taller than I am.
Yes. Breitbart daily caller, author of the Forthcoming, The Secret of Directional Investing. Right. So let me start with you. I saw, and I know you read, Kathleen Parker devastating piece on why Kamala Harris should resign. Is this a new season for the Washington Post? Is there something that's deeper going on here that we should delve into? Why all of a sudden, are they doing something to give clearance for Biden to select the new VP?
Wow. It's funny. Dave and I were just talking in the green room about how influential the Washington Post used to be, and back in the day, and when the Washington Post would editorialize, I'm stealing Dave's story here, the Hubert Humphrey should not run in 1972. We're talking ancient history now, and that was good enough for Humphrey. Humphrey said, okay, I guess I can't run if the Washington Post says I can't. Look, Kamala Harris is going to be on the ticket. She's not going anywhere. And the Washington Post can huff and puff, and it's just not gonna. It's a new world now where 100,000 websites and X feeds and so on matter more than what the Washington Post says.
Does it surprise you though that the president, who continues to deteriorate, that the Democrats have made a calculation that he is their nominee because he is running?
He's running. Folks don't give that up voluntarily. They have to be dragged out of there. And the fact of the matter is that if you're one of these Democrats at this point, what do you do if, in fact, he bails out on you? What do you do if you do remove him? You have an open war then within the Democratic Party, the Kamala Harris people, the folks from California who want Gavin Newsom. It comes to the last minute. It'd be one thing if you could do it smoothly, like, just he's gone, we're picking another guy, and everybody's going to be united. Wouldn't be that way. And so they look at it and they say, it's risky, and obviously she's slipping. That doesn't bother them because the staff can run things, they think. They're doing it now. And he might be able to win. Maybe he's got a better chance of winning than if he doesn't run. So I don't find it irrational that they're, from a political standpoint, that they're sort of circling the wagons around what they've got, as opposed to what they might end up with if they jettison it. It's not irrational. It may be bad for the country. It may ultimately be bad for their party, but it's not irrational.
Jim, everyone knows that the most important issue for Americans, overwhelmingly, is immigration. I just mentioned to Kash earlier that the president made it clear today he will pass no executive orders. If immigration is his Achilles heel on every poll, why won't he do something about it when he has the power to do so? Well,
it's funny, I wrote a piece for the American Conservative just a couple of days ago, recalling a book with a very evocative title. It was a political science book called Politicians Don't Pander. It's written in the year 2000 by two political scientists from Columbia and the University of Minnesota. And the argument they make is that, look, the popular conception of politicians is that they love to pander, right? They'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. However, the nature of the parties is such that the base of the Democrats and the base of the Republicans enforces an orthodoxy on them that makes it painful for politicians to say, I know what I'm supposed to tell you to make you like me, but the activists in my own party won't let me. And I think that's the challenge. Nothing characterizes Biden's 36-year career in the Senate better than ideological flexibility, right? He was on one side of the issue, the other side of the issue, and that's how you get elected 6 times in something it used to be a swing state. Now, the Biden administration is so thick with ideologues, open borders activists, and starting with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, that I think if Biden were to say, I think we should change this policy and move to the middle on this and kind of be more hawkish, like that fellow Tom Suozzi, who won the special election in New York a few weeks ago, on a more hawkish immigration position. I think if Biden were to say that, they just tell him, Mr. President, just really not an option for you. We're just kind of like, unless you fire us all, we're not going to do it. And so Biden is stuck with a position. I saw an NBC poll that was, do you support Trump's immigration position or Biden's immigration position? It was 50-20 Trump. But the Democrats are down 30 points in this issue. They would love to tell Biden would love to tell the American people what they want to hear, but they won't let him.
You know, David Keene, you're also a historian. You've seen many elections.
Being old doesn't make you a historian.
I didn't say you were old.
He's history.
You are a historian. Have you ever seen, in recent memory, two more polarizing titular heads of the party?
No.
And what does it say to us about our country?
Well, the politics of the country have changed. Technologies has something to do with some of it, but because now, Jim's exactly right, the parties have become more homogeneous. The bases of the parties have become more extreme in terms of the people in the party. It's always been the case. But the difference between today and, say, the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan in 1984 ran for re-election, where he won virtually everything, when that race began against Walter Mondale, 30% of the voters were classified as persuadable. Remember what Richard Nixon once said, to get your party's nomination, you go to the base, and to win the election, you go to the center. In 1984, and most of those persuadables ultimately went with Reagan. A few years later, in the year 2000, when George H.W. Bush ran against Al Gore, those same pollsters with the same questions found not 30% as persuadable, but 8%. That dictated a significant change in the way that candidates ran for office, because you didn't have to move to the center. There wasn't anything there. Let's say you got half of those. That's 4%. Meanwhile, they all discovered that the people that weren't voting, which could be 40% of the electorate, actually broke down pretty much the way the people that did vote were. So the gold was in mobilizing and enervating your base. And so you no longer had really rational discussions between the two parties. You had the two candidates speaking to their base. And that's what's happened in both parties. Now, whether that's good or bad is a different question, but that's what's happened. And so you don't have campaigns trying to figure out how to get that undecided voter. To heck with the undecided voter. You want to get the voter that's with you who didn't vote last time.
You know, we remember the third-party candidates, Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan. They certainly had their impacts. No one is really talking, Jim.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Dave remembers him.
That's a good one. No one's talking about Robert Kennedy Jr. from that political dynasty out of Massachusetts. In places like Michigan, these battleground states where the vote could be 1,000-point difference, could Kennedy loom large in this presidential election?
Well, I mean, if Dave said in 2000, 8% of the voters were persuadable, I suspect the percentage...
It's gone up since, but for different reasons.
All right, well, it's low. And
yeah.
So, look, this will be a game of inches, this election. And this is, again, two giant blocks, the red block and the blue block, and they're basically pretty solid. And so if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. can slice off a sliver of that, and he might do a little bit better than a sliver, it's possible he could swing the election one way or the other. And I'll even just say, it's conceivable. He's a smart guy, and he's got smart people around him. They may realize, I mean, I'm sure they do realize, that if somehow they could win one state, Michigan, again, a place like Michigan where Biden has really just fallen out of bed with the Arab Americans and so on, they could win one state, and then they were to sort of get lucky, and the election was so close that nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, It would then become what the Constitution calls a contingent election, and it would go to the U.S. House of Representatives. Right. And at that point, anything is possible. And you know, in 1800, they had a contingent election, and I think there were 35 votes. Yep. To pick the president. Ultimately, Thomas Jefferson won. And so when you get in that kind of...
And the loser said it was stolen.
Sorry?
Then the loser said it was stolen.
And nothing changes.
You know, David Keene, I'm just listening, reflecting on your extensive experience within the Republican Party and as a media figure, how do you compare the ideological direction and priorities, let's say, of the party today with those during your tenure, and what shifts do you find most significant?
Well, over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, maybe longer, something that was only noticed with the Trump presidency by most outside observers was that the two parties have been trading constituencies. When I grew up, the Republican Party was the party of the country club and the people who ran the factories and all of that sort of thing. The Democratic Party, my father was a union organizer for most of his life. My mother was president of the International Women's Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers. They were Democrats. They were working people. Today, Democrats not only do not have many working people in their base anymore, they don't much like them. And most of those people have shifted. And it's interesting because it's continuing, and it's going to dictate the politics of the next decade. Beginning in the 60s and 70s, we had what, remember, pollster Arthur Finkelstein used to call peripheral urban ethnics. Polish, Italian, Irish, people who'd been reliable parts of the Democratic bloc for almost a century, who began to drift away. They became the silent majority of Richard Nixon, the Reagan Democrats, and now the people that rejected the Democratic leadership. The same thing it started with a trickle, and it started in the McGovern years because the Democrats became sort of obnoxious to these people on foreign policy and social policy. The Republicans, being Republicans, were too dense to realize what was happening, but they accepted the votes, didn't do much for them. Now, we shift to today, the same thing is happening among Hispanic and black voters. There's a trickle. Not a flood yet, although it's starting to trickle pretty fast among Hispanic voters. Not because the Republicans are all that attractive to them, but because the Democrats have become more obnoxious to them on their values, and they're finding that they can't vote with them anymore. And that's a real threat to the Democratic constituency. Remember, when Barack Obama was elected, the book of the day was the emerging Democratic majority, and the argument was that because of demographic changes, because blacks and Hispanics would always do what they're supposed to do, which is vote for Democrats, that the Republicans couldn't win again. It turned out that when you start taking people for granted, they realize it. And so that trickle's beginning, but it's a repetition. We talk about history repeating itself. It's happening again, and it's happening to them for the same reason. The challenge Republicans have is, how do you talk to those people? How do you get to them? How do you lock them in? By 2016, when Trump was elected, these people were alienated from the party that they had fled, and the party that had accepted them had not really done much for them. And so they decided it was time to break up the furniture. And Donald Trump was the guy they sent in to do that.
And boy, did he break it up. Jim Pinkerton, David Keene, we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
You know, Jim, considering your background in conservative thought and media, how do you perceive sort of the evolution of conservative strategies and messaging from the past to the present digital age. We touched on this a little bit. And what key changes do you see have influenced conservative movements the most?
Well, I think the biggest change in the media since, say, the 80s, when you and I first met, Armstrong, and is the big block media. It used to be that the New York Times and CBS and NBC News were just sort of dominant, and that was sort of like, they said something was true, people believed it. And now it's been so fragmented. The nightly news used to get ratings in the 30s and 40s, and now it gets ratings in the 2s and 3s and 4s. And that just, there's so much proliferation of media. It changes the strategy. Do you really worry about television advertising as much as you do about digital communication and digital outreach and so on? Having said that, look, the basic issues of, are you pro-family or anti-family? Are you pro-tax or anti-tax? Those things kind of never change. How do you feel about foreign wars? I mean, you could pick the issues of 1968, Vietnam, inflation, riots, and transplant that to 2020 or 2024, and you'd say, well, that's kind of similar. I mean, as Dave said, the coalitions have changed enormously from the Republicans used to be the country club party. Now the Democrats are what they call the wine rack party. It's the sort of same concept. So you could argue it either way. You could either argue everything's changed or nothing's changed.
What are traditional conservative values now?
Well, I don't think they've changed much. In years past, I haven't been involved with it in the last half dozen years, but I used to run the Conservative Political Action Conference when I was chairman of the American Conservative Union. And each year we would take a poll. The straw poll part of it would get media attention, but what we really did was we asked the attendees, which was often as many as 10,000 people from all over the country, about where they stand on issues. And it turned out that in any given year, there might be defense and foreign policy issues were at the fore in the context of the political discussion in the media and elsewhere, or social issues, abortion or this or that, or taxes and the other. But all through about 30 years, the basic values of the attendees through all that remained stable and didn't change. The emphasis could change based on different candidates and different things that were going on in the world. But the conservative values, the belief in individual freedom, the belief in traditional values, the belief in America's place in the world, all remain pretty much the same, and I think still do. That doesn't mean that you don't have violent fights, over specifics, because not everybody agrees on everything. But I'm an optimist in terms of the conservative values. That's why people have moved toward the Republican Party even when they don't accept the fact that they represent traditional values. And it's something that's more in the people than in the parties. And the parties have to recognize this. The Democrats have just decided we want a different world, so we're going to ignore that. The Republicans saying we don't know quite what we want, but the people know pretty much what they want on immigration, on crime, on taxes, on government spending. They get it. And that's not changed, and it's not about to change. So the question that you have to have is, and this comes about as a result of these shifting coalitions, is when new people come into the party. Remember, we've had when the Goldwater people came in, the Reagan people, the evangelicals in the Republican Party. There are two ways to deal with them, to make sure that they know they've got people that care about them. You can either pander to them, which has been a traditional Republican way of trying to do it in standard politics, or you can take your values and you can say, how do these values affect these people, and why should they share those values with us? In that context, if you remember Jack Kemp and his tax policy, that wasn't new tax policy, but Jack Kemp realized that those policies, that what he was advocating weren't so much for the for the upper classes and all that. They were for the average American. And when they sold it that way, when they talked about what they'd supported all along, but they talked it in a different context, it became very popular. And that's part of, I'm not talking about just slapping a different label on a traditional policy, but taking what you believe in and then looking at what the people who you're trying to attract believe in, and finding comparisons and finding common ground, and then going out and talking to them about that. That's how you lock them in, and then you deliver things for them. Not what the other party would deliver, because you can't compete on that. You've got to compete on the things that you're strong at and you believe in, and that can be done. That's the challenge that any political party faces continually, to hold on to its base values, to represent why people got into it in the first place on the one hand, and to take those values and attract new people on the other.
So Jim, in your many years of covering presidential elections, what is it that is being underreported, that we're missing, that could have a huge impact on the outcome in the 2024 presidential and national elections?
Well, I think I guess I would have to say, given the news of just the last few days, the ability of the establishment to use what's been called lawfare, as in that's law plus warfare combined into one word, lawfare, and the ability of the Biden administration, the establishment, the New York City, New York State officialdom to attack President Trump on 4 or 5 different legal issues, and I'll say it, genuinely draw blood. I mean, that this issue of whether President Trump can pay $450 million that the New York State, in a pretty fishy case, if you ask me, has imposed on him. That's gonna. This is mid-March, and we'll see what other, artillery shells the legal establishment can fire at President Trump, and I think I wouldn't underestimate them. I'm old enough to remember, when Spiro Agnew was driven out of office in 1973, and Richard Nixon was driven out of office in 1984, and I worked at the White House during the Iran-Contra investigation in the 80s, and so I think that people will, when the history books are written of the 24 election, I think there'll be a lot of discussion about issues and family values and taxes and everything. And then they'll also say, what was Merrick Garland and Jack Smith and Fonnie Willis and Alvin Bragg and Letitia James, what were these people doing, and how was that all getting going, and when did they start to decide to do this, and so on. I think that will be. And frankly, I think the Democrats are sort of proud of themselves enough for doing this. I think they'll be happy to write books. Oh yeah, and then we decided.
So like Kash, you don't believe that any of these 91+ charges against the former president have any legitimacy?
I didn't say that. I think in general, the wisdom of a prosecutor is you can indict a ham sandwich. Mm-hmm. As in, the sandwich is what it is, and if you made your life in New York City contracting, and Dave and I were talking about this with Spiro Agnew and Joe Biden, in the green room. If you just live in that world, you probably, and the Cato Institute has a study that says the average American, forget a billionaire, commits 3 crimes a day. Yep. It's just sort of one of those things where you don't really realize it, but when you did your taxes wrong, or you made a right turn on red or something, you've broken the law somewhere. And it's the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian thing.
That is a fascinating insight, that the average American break the law 3 times a day. I can't believe we're out of time. It's just such an honor to have you, Jim.
When Franklin Roosevelt appointed Robert Jackson Attorney General, he said to the people at the Justice Department, do you realize that we have the power and the laws, and they didn't have as many then as they do now, to send anybody we want to prison? But that's not our job.
And we'll leave it on that note. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams. Wow.